Hey guys, it's Graham. Welcome back to Trucker Man Reads. November is upon us. It is now pilgrim time. Hope you guys all had a great Halloween yesterday. Party I went to actually got shut down by the cops. Not as exciting as it sounds. It was a bunch of us, aging millennials sitting there talking about books. Everybody else was kind of dressed normally, and then I'm there in my full-on Graham Reaper getup. But somebody's kid had a family phone and butt dialed 911, and the cops showed up. We're like, all right, well, I guess that's time to close this party down. But now, bright and early the next day, I'm out here in the shop. My staycation is coming to an end, and I figured I would lug all these books out. I've got them here on the table next to me, and give you a rundown of books that I've read and still want to read about the Mayflower, about the Pilgrims, about Plymouth, the subject that has basically made this channel from day one, going back 5 years. So here's the rundown. Bookmark any of these if you want to. I'll probably take time to put affiliate links down in the description, so if you want to grab a copy off of Amazon, little bites like that help the channel out and feed my habit of books. So without further ado, here we go. One of the oldest known titles is Mort's Relation. This is a very simple paperback. There's a great preface to this one written by Dwight Heath, who explains the history of this book. There's this fantastic site here of, let me get it in the right lighting. You can see what the insert page looked like 400 years ago. With how they used F's instead of S's and what written English looked like. It's almost inspiring with how confusing it is. And here's a period accurate map of New England and of the Massachusetts Bay Harbor. This is really cool. I believe that it was written by Edward Winslow. That's what the introduction talks about. The name Mort was the cause of some confusion. So check out Mort's Relation. It's one of the oldest and most original sources that we have, written by somebody who was there about what happened in the early years at Plymouth. In that same vein, we have Of Plymouth Plantation, written by William Bradford. I believe it was a few decades after the fact, although he was in charge of kind of keeping a personal journal and a chronicle of the colony. I want to say that this was put together in the 1640s. And then the manuscript went missing until the 19th century. Some university in England found it and figured out what it was and gave it back to the United States. Said, hey, you might want this. This is a very dense book. I have not read this entire thing. I've read probably the first half of it a couple of years ago. And there's a particular edition of it put together by, I believe, Harold Paget, who did the script that then went on to be used for the audiobook on Audible. So I've listened to a lot of the audiobook and I've read a lot of the passages in print. I had a lesser edition of this book at one time, but this is the very complete hardcover. I still want to read this entire thing, but this is one of the resources that a lot of historians have used to write a more complete assessment and analysis in the modern day. Another very old and original resource that I haven't finished reading is A Key into the Language of America, written by Roger Williams. This is a guy who showed up later. He wasn't with the original Mayflower Pilgrim wave, but he showed up later and actually went and lived among the Narragansetts, who were, I believe they were under the Algonquin tree of Indian tribes, but they weren't Wampanoags. I'm still trying to get clarity on what that whole layout looked like. They spoke a similar language, but it wasn't the exact same language that the Peconicots and the Patuxets and the Nausetts would have spoken at what is modern-day Plymouth. But he gives us an analysis and some examples of their written language. It was I can't remember if it's synthetic or non-synthetic. There's some particular term that I'm still trying to figure out. It's very different from the languages that I'm familiar with, mostly being Romance languages, and I've got a little bit of familiarity with the Teutonics. This one is obviously a completely different set. They like to make big words that run together, but that are very heavily context reliant. And I believe that is a component that several other Native American tongues have in common, which is why the Navajo code talkers were such an asset during World War II. Their language was just so different, and it was easy to conceal things in them. Not just in those same ways that English is different from Japanese, but it's even so different from English that it was basically impossible to crack, and they performed a crucial and an essential function to success in the Pacific Theater. In much the same way, so far as I understand, and I may find more information when I do get through the end of this one, the Algonquian languages were, again, heavily context dependent. And even after I tried to run several phrases through AI and stress test them and say, how would you say this? This sounds similar to something else that you've told me before. I would get little analyses and explanations that ultimately sent me down a rabbit hole, which resulted in me acquiring a copy of this book. There's a preface that I've read where Roger Williams talks about why he decided to tackle this experiment and what it looked like when he did. And that was fascinating. I'm sure that the actual text of it is going to be a little bit more dry and slow to get through. But so far, this has been a very intriguing resource into the Algonquian language tree. Now, as for the Mayflower herself, you've probably seen this book. It was the one that I used for my now famous, it's over 660,000 views, video about the Mayflower passengers. I was basically just summarizing a lot of research that Caleb H. Johnson did. I decided to grab a paperback of this. I had to check out a hardcover from the library to do that original cluster of research. This has been fascinating to read, and I've also found other resources that quibble with minor particulars here and there about what he found. I'm probably due to go through it again, but the more I read about this subject, the more I see that there are little pieces here and there on which historians are discordant. But this is still a very strong reference book to use to look up particulars on any given passenger on the ship. And then we also have a Zell Ames edition of the Mayflower ship's log. This is a very dry read, pun not intended, of the day-to-day operations of the ship, who owned it, who the crewmen were. We don't have a whole lot of names when it comes to that. They were just, there were 25 or 30 of them. We know who Christopher Jones was, who the captain was, and then it just gets into a lot of dry details. And this edition has very tightly written script, as you can see. It's more of a technical resource, but it's a strong addition to the overall historical corpus of books that we use to learn about this subject. So I found it beneficial in that sense. Here are two books with similar titles that are contemporary. Nathaniel Philbrick, this is probably the first narrative that I read about the Mayflower back in 2019. The one by Rebecca Fraser here, this is the most, what's the right way to say this? Like, this is a very complete look at it, and I think it's even more thorough and more fair than Philbrick is. After I've read more of Philbrick's work, he tends to take, at times, an unnecessarily antagonistic view of certain resulting actions and stuff, whereas I felt like Rebecca Fraser was very objective in her analysis of both the Pilgrim side and the Wampanoag side of the conflict. I say conflict because both of these books start at a point before the Pilgrims left England. It explains a little bit about why they decided to do that, and then it gets into the foundation of Plymouth and the next several decades of peace and their economies and the mutually beneficial arrangement that they had, which then devolved in the 1670s and resulted in the King Philip's War. And I think especially Rebecca Fraser took great steps to show exactly how that happened and all of the external influences that resulted in getting there. That's a video subject for another day. But the Pilgrims did eventually go to war with the Wampanoags, but it wasn't the same Pilgrims that arrived in 1620, nor the same Wampanoags that made that pact of mutual friendship and prosperity with them. It's a much more complicated story than just, hey, the Pilgrims showed up and then they fought the Indians that helped them. As always, history is messier, and it's important to be really fair with those details. Fraser was. This is still probably my favorite book that covers that entire 55-year span of history. But Philbrick's is still very good and worth the read, and he gives a lot of information early on about the Wampanoags and about Squanto that wasn't so much the focus of Fraser's book. If I could sum up one other key difference, I would say that Philbrick focuses a lot more on William Bradford's timeline from Plymouth, whereas Fraser follows Edward Winslow. Bradford was the second governor of Plymouth, Winslow was the third, and he also did a lot more traveling back and forth between Plymouth and England for business and governance reasons. So you get two different and two very valuable perspectives on the overall timeline there. Now, these two books are going to be probably a little bit more polarizing because their tone is a little bit more combative, but they are beneficial because they are pushing back on false narratives about the Pilgrims and what happened when they showed up at Plymouth. Jeff Finpal, I did a video on this book earlier this year. He touches on the Pilgrims, but he's got a much broader scope than just them. It's generally talking about different clusters of Europeans that showed up in America from 1492 onward and what their relations were like with the natives. And he's there to dispel a lot of false narratives put together by histrionics and activists who want to rewrite the history of the interactions between Europeans and Native Americans leading up to the modern day. This is a fantastically well-researched and well-executed book. But like I said, the tone is going to be combative just by the nature of what it is up against. 1620 is the same thing. It's a lot of analytical details about Plymouth and the Pilgrims when they showed up, but it was written as a critical response, like it says right there in the title, to the 1619 project, which I have nothing but contempt for. And so if you've encountered that, this is going to be the counterbalance to a lot of the false arguments that Nicole Hannah-Jones put forward in that project. Finally, these two here, I got them last year. This one is going to be another long and dry, detailed read. It covers everything from 1620 to 1691. Like I said, those other two books by Philbrick and Fraser, they cover 16, like 18 or so, up to like the 1670s. This goes even beyond that, and it's a lot of like dry business details and stuff. It goes year by year. I expect that this book is going to take me a lot of time to get through. And even though I bought it last year, it's going to be the subject of probably November 2026 of a long and detailed read for me there. I expect to still find more information from it that I haven't gotten elsewhere, but I know that it's going to demand a slow burn. So I'll probably even start reading it in October of 26 to do my videos for next November. This one I bought last year, and I started reading it. I wasn't able to finish it in time. This is a focus specifically on Thanksgiving and on the history of the holiday. Obviously, it'll touch on the Pilgrims and on the Mayflower and such, but this is going to talk more about the cultural side of things. I've also got a picture book in the house. It's for the kids. I didn't bring it in here. Let me find a picture and I'll put it up right there. There's a really great picture book put together by, I already forget the lady's name, but it talks about Sarah Josepha Hale, who was pushing for like 30 years in the 1800s to have a real cultural revival around the holiday of Thanksgiving. And it wasn't until the Civil War kicked off and Abraham Lincoln was like, hey, we need something nationally to unify around, that Sarah Josepha Hale got a hold of him and was like, hey, I've been writing to every president before you since like the 1830s to say, hey, here's a list of celebrations and cultural traditions that we could adopt to revive Thanksgiving, which had been established in the 1780s by President Washington, but it had kind of fallen by the wayside. Sarah Josepha Hale was a major driving force in reviving Thanksgiving, and it ended up playing a role in that formation of a new national identity through the Civil War. The picture book is very succinct, artwork's great, it gets the bullet points of what actually happened. I recommend you check out that one. This one, being a dry and detailed nonfiction, as I am wont to read on this subject, we'll go into a lot more detail about it, and I'm interested to see what kind of conclusions James W. Baker comes to. I might be able to read this one this month, but right now there's a book that I have to finish, which is probably the magnum opus of Thanksgiving books, and this is by George F. Willardson. It came out in 1945. It's called Saints and Strangers. That title might sound familiar to you. 10 years back, Nat Geo did a mini-series about 1620 and 1621. I'm going to do a whole different video about that this month. But this, so far, I'm not quite finished with it. I've got about 100 pages left to go, and I'm really going to try to finish it this weekend before my staycation ends. There's a lot of, it's probably like 50 pages of indices and appendices and stuff at the end. But this is a very detailed, slow burn that starts even back in probably the mid-1500s to describe the genesis of the religious separatist movement that would eventually sweep up elders like William Brewster, who then became kind of a surrogate father and mentor to William Bradford, and all the other families that first went to the Leyden colony in the Netherlands and then ultimately ended up in Plymouth in 1620. Willardson focuses on some lost and overlooked details that I have found not only fascinating, but very worthwhile to know. I could do an entire months of content on this channel about the stuff in this book, and I will read it again in my lifetime. I highly recommend people look it up. The thing is, it's kind of fallen by the wayside. Even in my reading of it, I found a couple of other details that have since been corrected in the historical record. Nevertheless, overall, this is a very valuable book, and there have been times when I'm just sitting there reading it, and I'll stop my wife with whatever she's doing, and I'll read a couple of paragraphs to her, and it's just like, this is so crazy and cool to know about not only these people and also the Wampanoags and the details that Willardson is able to find about them, but what the world was really like at that time. You can't help but understand how things played out the way they did and what drove the Pilgrims to show up in America and what drove the Wampanoags to want to help them and what that relationship actually looked like. This is an incredibly well done book. I want to read the introduction to you just here. There's a preface that Willardson put together to kind of talk about how the book came together. He says, it is about time, I think, that the Pilgrims were allowed to tell their own story, and so far as it can be readily and readably managed in their own words. The way that they wrote in the 1620s was very different from how we spoke today. It wasn't really uniform, and it was kind of confusing to read. They were always quite able to speak for themselves and never had any diffidence in doing so. They wrote marvelous letters, as fresh and crisp today as when penned 3 centuries ago. Though relatively few, their chronicles are remarkably rich in the very stuff of human life. They will stand forever as a bright, clear mirror of all the hopes and fears that lie closest to men's hearts. In essaying this group biography, I am particularly indebted to the patient labors of three great Pilgrim scholars, all now dead. And he's saying this in the 1940s. Henry Martin Dexter, Edward Arbor, and Charles Edward Banks. Without their years of exhaustive digging in musty archives to unearth every existing scrap of information about the Pilgrims and their families, many of the latter would still remain mere names. This guy went to people who did all the digging to find original sources, and he's doing everything that he can to condense it into this 450-page narrative. And even then, it's still very heavily and densely packed with detail that demands a slow burn read, which is the type of read that I'm trying to get more into doing with books on this subject. I started reading that book in May, but when I say I started reading, I really wasn't sitting down to tear off big chunks of it, because that's when I was still in the middle of knocking out a manuscript for a fantasy novel about the Pilgrims, teaming up with the Wampanoags to fight a harvest demon. That book is actually under review with a publisher right now. And as soon as I finished that one, I started working on a draft of a book for that same publisher for a writing contest. If I win it, I'll get a good chunk of money in a publishing contract. So I've been really busy at the computer this last year. I've written 3 manuscripts in the last 11 months, one of which sold and just came out this week. It's a children's book, then the Thanksgiving fantasy book, and then another book that I'll talk about at another time. But the point is that I haven't really had a whole lot of time to sit down and do physical reading, because if I had that time, I needed to be doing manuscript work to get these books out and get them sold. But now that I've finally had time since the end of September, I've been making major progress on Saints and Strangers. Like I said, I'll finish it this weekend, and I've got a lot of really cool videos and subjects to focus on in the coming weeks as we gear up for Thanksgiving. It's about 4 weeks away. And it's one of my favorite holidays of the year. I'm really glad that I got this wild hair in me in 2018 when I took my kids to the library, and I asked the librarian, hey, do you have any books about Thanksgiving? And she pointed me to this one. I still need to get a physical copy of it. It's a picture book, but I say picture book in the sense of like photography. There was kind of a reenactment that they did out at Plymouth with Pilgrim descendants and Wampanoag descendants. And they did a reenactment of what those days looked like of that first Thanksgiving in 1621. And the Smithsonian went out and photographed all of it. And I guess they sponsored this book. And like I said, I need to get a copy of it. I started reading that one to the kids, and it got me intrigued. And that eventually put me on the path to Caleb H. Johnson's book, which was kind of my gateway drug to all of these. It's just a subject that I love. And the more that I read about it, the more I find these people and their lives to be inspiring and informative and instructive, and at times cautionary. But it's something that I'm passionate about, and that passion came from just one little tiny piece of curiosity that I had 7 years ago. And now here I am, hoping to kind of give some of that to you guys. Check out any one of these books if you're curious. I hope I gave an accurate enough description. Oh, one final one here that I didn't talk about. My brother got me this for my birthday last year, Project Mayflower. In the 1950s, an American and an Englishman with, one of them had an idea and the other one had investment to back it, built an accurate replica of the Mayflower with period accurate and period era whatever technology, and then they sailed it from England to the United States in 1957. I want to say they didn't take exactly the same route, but how they got there and what they did to make it and what's been done with that boat ever since then. That's the boat that is at the Plymouth Patuxent Museum today, and you can walk on board and you can get a feeling for how big the boat wasn't. And how the Pilgrims had to cram themselves into the cargo hold for 2 months on crappy seas to get to America in 1620. This was a really, really cool book. I'm pretty sure I did a video of it on the channel. But check out any one of these. They're just great. Like I said, I'll take time to put the affiliate links down in the description. Thanks for watching. Until next time, drive safe. See you out there.